It's not every day that I get to interview one of my journalistic heroes. That's why today is very special. Earlier, I had the chance to speak with Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of many excellent books, including the latest entitled Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. I first asked Chris about the cross-section of activism and journalism, two concepts that I've embraced and practiced every day on this show. Here's what he had to say.
I don't think that, being an activist and, it necessarily impedes the possibility of being an effective journalist. As long as one always tells the truth. It's journalists who serve a particular ideology or belief system. And MSNBC would be a perfect example of that. MSNBC is largely a propaganda arm of the Democratic Party. That's a problem for me. It's being independent of power, being in perpetual alienation with power, which I think is really what real activists are, that dovetails with what great journalism should be. It's journalists who identify with ideological systems or systems of power that become compromised. And I speak as someone who worked for 15 years at the New York Times, where the unwritten credo of the New York Times is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and for money. You can alienate them sometimes, but not a lot. And reporters who tended to alienate either centers of power or commercial interests a lot got pushed out of the newspaper. So I don't see, I think that's a kind of false division. I think that the notion of objectivity itself has been used very perniciously by the commercial media to often not tell the truth and not take the kind of moral stance that I think real journalism should always take.
Well put. Going right into the nomination of Brennan as director of the CIA, we just saw him being announced yesterday. I mean, he's someone who applauded, cheerleaded torture under Bush, pioneered extrajudicial assassination. I mean, his appointment was hotly debated in 2008, yet now there's this glaring lack of contention, Chris. What happened?
Well, the assault on civil liberties under the Obama White House has been worse than under the Bush White House, whether that's the radical interpretation of the 2001 authorization to use military force act as giving the president the right to assassinate American citizens, whether it is the FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans, whether it is the use of the Espionage Act 6 times, and we just saw a CIA official get indicted to 30 months in prison, the espionage against whistleblowers, and that's not how the Espionage Act, written in 1917, was designed. It's a kind of Foreign Secrets Act, or whether that's the Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, and I sued the president over this section and won in the Southern District Court of New York. It's now on appeal, was appealed by the Obama administration, and is before the appellate court, the Second Circuit Appellate Court in New York, where oral arguments will be heard in February, which permits the U.S. military to seize American citizens who substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, hold them in military facilities, strip them of due process, and keep them there indefinitely. This all occurred under the Obama administration, not to mention, of course, the expansion of the drone attacks. So, what we're seeing is a system that is set in place, both in terms of the diminishing of traditional civil liberties, the expansion of imperial war, the looting of the U.S. Treasury on the part of Wall Street firms has continued unabated under the Obama White House. On all of these major structural issues, there is no difference between George Bush and Barack Obama, and on some issues like civil liberties, Obama's worse.
Right, and I keep saying, I mean, he's entering his 4th term, especially with appointing someone like Brennan, and the systematic erosion of our civil liberties. The anti-war movement also completely died, but the Bush policies continued. Did blind party loyalty cause the death of the liberal class?
Yeah, what happened was in 2004, the leaders of the anti-war movement, and I think in a very misguided decision, decided to call a moratorium on demonstrations to elect John Kerry, who during the campaign, if you remember, out-Bush Bush. I would have never withdrawn from Fallujah. I mean, it was, and I think that this is part of the left's failure, that it's not our job to take power. It's our job to stand fast around moral imperatives and challenge all centers of power, Democratic and Republican. And so, yes, I think the anti-war movement itself bears a great deal of culpability for its demise, that it never really resurrected itself after that decision.
Right. It almost seemed like it was just popular, really shined a light on how, really where was the anti-war movement in general. I mean, how could it just die as the wars continue? I wanted to follow up with something that you recently wrote in a column about how every progressive populist movement has been completely destroyed in this country. And you followed up by saying this really impactful quote to me. You said, a proto-fascist movement that coalesces around a mystical nationalism that fuses the symbols of the country with those of Christianity, that denigrates reason and elevates mass emotions, will have broad appeal. What is the danger of having a movement that's so radically nationalistic become the new revolutionary force in this country?
Well, in essence, what we are suffering through is political paralysis, the inability by the formal systems of power to respond rationally to both an environmental and an economic crisis. The longer that paralysis continues, I watched it, I covered the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the war in Yugoslavia, the more you empower radical fringe groups and extremist elements within the society who become disgusted with traditional liberal values because they don't function. And that's where we are. And so we have proto-fascist forces in the United States coalesced around the Christian right, around the Tea Party, around nativist elements, militia groups, etc. And these function as fascist groups do. They fuse the iconography, language of nationalism, rabid nationalism, with religion, with the Christian faith. They direct a legitimate sense of betrayal and rage towards the weak and the vulnerable within the society. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, liberals. They have a long list of people they hate. They speak, of course, in the language of violence. They celebrate the gun culture. And they're real. And, of course, they're bankrolled by the most retrograde elements of American capitalism embodied in the Koch brothers and others. And as the paralysis perpetuates, as the state is unable to respond rationally to the suffering and grievances of the poor, the working, and increasingly the middle class, you will find this rage expressed through these elements. This is coupled with the decision by the state, I think a very misguided one, to shut down nonviolent, peaceful protests embodied in the Occupy movement. I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which sort of chronicles how we destroyed our populist and radical movements, and then in the name of anti-communism, our liberal institutions. So that means those of us who care about democratic populism, who care about a society built around a kind of equality and concern for the vulnerable and the weak, are deeply disempowered at a very dangerous moment in American history.